Hi, thank you for watching Yoga with Elia. This is Elia, and today I would like to do a quick review, hopefully not too quick, on the Vinyasa transition or the Vinyasa flow transition, which I'm sure most of you will recognize if you take almost any class anywhere in the world. 90% of those classes will have the Vinyasa flow transition in them, which is basically Chaturanga, going to upward dog and returning back to downward dog before doing the next pose. High plank isn't really a traditional like standalone pose onto itself, but high plank is actually going to be useful for us to review because if you need to attend to certain alignments and certain actions in the body, it's hard to get all of that to happen while hovering in low plank. Those of you that know low plank, you know that it's not the kind of pose that you can easily just surrender and rest in while taking care of some of the other parts of the body. So we use high plank and we import the lessons that we derive from high plank into low plank because the only real difference is just arms are bent in one and they're straight in the other. And so if your arms are straight, it's a lot easier on your arms, your shoulders, and your chest to maintain that integrity while working elsewhere in the body. So the first part of high plank and low plank and that whole planking relationship is to understand what forces the body is susceptible to when it's in that position. So if you get into high plank, you can even do it in a kneeling high plank. The question of where does the body want to just naturally collapse to, where's the tendency, is going to be to have the abdomen and the ribs kind of fall forward, right? Even if you're on your knees, this is a path of least resistance. Now, I want to say why that is completely useless and even dangerous is because if you let your ribs fall forward, which means you're really letting your torso extend, you're letting your back extend, you're inhibiting, you're literally turning off or at least diminishing the ability of your core muscles to stay intact. Because if you analyze your core muscles here in the front, their contraction pulls you forward, right? It pulls you into spinal flexion, which is what we do when we do sit-ups, boat poses, any core work has to do really with flexion of the torso. And why the core is so important in high plank and low plank and any plank is because your core, which is really your abdominal wall, it's called the core because it is literally the center of your body, and not just center as far as geography, where it is by relationship to the head or the feet. It's also the core musculoskeletally. So your strength, your power, your integrity, your competence in the core influences the competence of every other movement that's peripheral to the core. And because of the nature of low plank, we need to ensure that the shoulders and the arms are supported in their stability, which also means their safety. And so to ensure their safety, we have to see what ensures that, which is the core. Now, the muscle that I want to focus on really the most, and the entire core counts, but the muscle for our intents and purposes here is to analyze the rectus abdominis muscle, which runs right here, right down the middle of the body. And you can see that the attachments of the rectus abdominis, its origin being here centrally at the ribs, at the bottom ribs, going all the way down to the pubic bone. You think of muscles, what do muscles do? They contract. That's their only job. When they're active, they contract. When they're relaxed, they lengthen. So if you think, what does a muscle that connects this point to these points, what does activity in that muscle, what movement that creates? As these points come close together, you have trunk flexion, but you also have a posterior pelvic tilt. And just to put that quickly into context, an anterior pelvic tilt is when you stick your butt out, and a posterior tilt is when you pull your butt, your sit bones in. And so that comes from your rectus abdominis. So when you turn that on, and again, you can either try in a kneeling plank or all the way in a high plank, It might be easier to try in a kneeling plank first if you're not used to it, just to get acquainted with the movement of pulling your ribs towards your pubic bone and your pubic bone towards the ribs. So it's as if you're creating some amount of rounding in your spine. And if you get a good handle on that, being on your knees, then you can try it, of course, taking your knees off the ground in low plank. So that's the core. And the second part that we're now are brought to in the whole planking relationship is what to do with the legs. And it comes back to the same analysis of when you're parallel to the ground in this position, where do the legs really want to end up, right? They want to end up in this position. So your knees want to fall down. So we have to work away from the path of least resistance and lift the knees up. So the question then becomes, what lifts the knees up? And it's the quadricep muscles. And a footnote about the quadricep muscles in specific, but leg strength, and think of it in terms of leg prowess in general, what I've seen over all my time of teaching, what I've seen from many students, even teachers, is there's an inadequate amount of leg effort that's being expended in most postures. And I even see this in standing postures where these are actually the most relevant, the most important, the most safety creating aspects of the posture. People are not yet well acquainted with how to engage their legs. So when you practice this at home, when you practice lifting your knees off the ground in high and low plank at home, what will likely happen is you're going to get a lot of fatigue in the legs. But just know that behind that fatigue is a history, perhaps, of not engaging these legs to the amount that they needed to be engaged. So if you undertrain any muscle, training that muscle will bring about fatigue quickly. But fatigue is what ensures the growth and development of its strength and function. So if your muscles get fatigued, you can almost see that as a clear sign of being on the right track. And your muscles, if you fatigue them over and over again, give it enough time, give it enough persistence, they will become stronger. I guarantee you they have no choice but to become stronger. But the legs and the quads, they're actually much more in support, not just of their own function, but of what we just talked about regarding the core. And what this means is we look at where the quadriceps are located and we look at where the rectus abdominis is located. Now what you see is this is the front of the body, right? In scientific speak, it's just the anterior part of the body. And it is well known that any part of your body, so the front of your body, any part that has several groups of muscles, or any direction of your body that has several groups of muscles on it, so for example, you've got the chest, the abs, the quadriceps, and all the way down to your lower leg muscles, when they are placed, when they are on one same side of the body, they are linked together in a neurological chain, just oftentimes referred to as a kinetic chain. And of course, if it's the front of the body, it's the anterior kinetic chain, and if it's the back of the body, it's the posterior kinetic chain. So what that means, because there's this neurological relationship to all of the muscles, or between all of the muscles that are found on any single side of the body, it means that the activation of one of those links in the chain will heighten the likelihood of activation of other muscles in the links of that chain. So when you engage your quads, it means you are much more likely to effectively engage your core. And even though it might take more effort to do that, that effort will actually start to synthesize the function of these two seemingly separate muscle groups together into one emergent, functional, and most of all, solid and protective whole. So when you get into high plank, you can almost think of it as really try to overwork how well you're pulling your front ribs down, you're lifting your pubic bone up, and how much energy you're putting into straightening your legs. And so as you get used to that, your body adapts to it and it becomes much more insured. Now, the legs and the rectus abdominis, the legs and the core, is something that we need to actually get into grips with so that as we descend down to low plank, we're going to be able to maintain their effort so that our shoulders are much better protected. And this brings us to the second part, to the first part technically of our Vinyasa transition, which is Chaturanga. Now, Chaturanga being a low plank, since we already covered the legs and the core, the only thing we really have to look at is what to do with the arms and the shoulders. And of course, the position of the hands, the position of the arms or the shoulders relative to the hands are definitely the most widely disputed elements of doing proper Chaturanga. And so what I would like to start with is just looking at the relevant structural anatomy of the shoulder and seeing where its weak points are. Now, if you look at just the skeletal anatomy of your shoulder, you will see that the front of the shoulder has very, very little protective structures that prevent the head of your upper arm bone, the head of your humerus, from sliding out anteriorly, which is just commonly called anterior displacement, or worse yet, it can be anterior dislocation. Now, it's important to know that like 90-95% of all shoulder dislocations happen anteriorly. So this is a lot to say about what the inherent protective elements are of the shoulder, and we see where its weakest and strongest points are in this following diagram. Now, knowing that that's the case, we can put that Chaturanga, the low plank, under the same exact analysis. So I'm just going to do it on my knees so it's a little easier to talk and not have to hold as much tension. So if you lower down to low plank, traditionally, this is the traditional alignment, the tendency of your body weight to fall forward is the same as it was in high plank. But now, because there's right here nothing underneath the front of the shoulders to support it and push it off the ground, there's going to be a lot of susceptibility for the shoulders to come forward towards the ground, which is basically that anterior displacement of your humerus. So we have to see how can we do Chaturanga in order to safeguard the humerus from being anteriorly displaced. And now this comes to the point of where to keep the upper arm bones relative to the torso. Now here's what's commonly taught, as you might recognize, is you keep the elbows right up against the torso, right up against the ribs, and you lower down that way. Okay? And how we know whether or not this is a better position of the upper arm or not is just to compare to the only other possible arm position. And what's the only other possible arm position? It's going to be something closer to just the traditional push-up angle that you have between your upper arm and your torso, which is roughly 30 degrees, say. Now, what's the difference between having your upper arm at 30 degrees from the body or 0 degrees from the body? What is the difference, not just in the space here? How does that show up differently in your shoulder? And you can see if you keep your hands stationary, because when you lower down to Chaturanga, you're not sliding your hands, they stay in place the whole time. If you keep your hand in the same place and you go from this position now to this more classical push-up position, the movement that creates in the shoulder is called internal rotation. Now, internal rotation is basically if you have your arm out in this position, you just turn it in. That's internal rotation as opposed to going the other way, which is external rotation. And how you can simply test out a lot of these movements, because they can be a little bit deceiving or ambiguous when your elbow is bent, is you just think, what is the shoulder position here if I straighten my elbow compared to if I take my elbow out to the side and I straighten my elbow here. And you can see that between these two, this position, where your elbow is distant from the torso, is much more into internal rotation. Now, why am I bringing up internal rotation? It's for one specific reason. It's because of a certain muscle in your rotator cuff. Your rotator cuff is a combination of four muscles that kind of guide the rhythm of your shoulders as it moves through its range of motion. The part of your rotator cuff that's important in internal rotation, the only one that internally rotates it really, is the subscapularis. Now, what you can see in that subscapularis picture is that obviously we know that it internally rotates, but even more importantly, where it's located. So it's located, it originates, that is, on the back of the body, because it originates on the underside of your shoulder blade. But then it connects right here on the front of the body, on the lesser tubercle of your humerus. So when it contracts, one thing it does, yes, is it internally rotates the humerus, the shoulder. But because of where it begins and it ends, and because we know that muscles shorten when they contract, if you bring the front and the back together, what's going to happen is you're going to end up posteriorly retracting the humerus just enough to keep it from popping out, because as we already know, there's no protective structure here on the front of your shoulder joint other than muscle in your joint capsule. But they're definitely not enough, and so we have to employ action in order to keep it from anteriorly misplacing, or worse yet, dislocating, which hopefully is not going to happen in our yoga class. So that's the position of the upper arms. Much more towards classical position, because again, it helps you internally rotate the upper arm bone, and the internal rotation calls your subscapularis muscle into action, and then that action posteriorly retracts your upper arm bone and keeps the front of that joint a lot more safe, a lot less likely to get impacted against. Now, the second part is where to place the hands with respect to the shoulders. So again, to show what the classical way of doing it is, or what the most common way of doing it is, you come down like this. You have to keep you're told to keep your elbows above the wrists, and you keep your shoulders forward of the hands. I already said how that position places nothing underneath the front of your shoulder that will help you pull it back. So what I want to propose, and what I've been taught, and this isn't just my theory or it's not just my opinion, but it really is the teachings that were imparted to me, that were themselves imparted to my teachers, just looking at the basic arithmetic of our anatomy. Because if you look at our anatomical structure, if you look at it closely enough, the structure of our anatomy suggests what movements are possible and what movements are impossible. So for example, if you study the bones that make up the elbow, you will see by the structure of the bones themselves that your elbow is only meant to bend in one direction. So it's not anybody's theory that the elbow is meant to bend in one direction. It is just the composition of your joints. Simple enough. So if you keep your hands like this, so I'll turn to the side. If you keep your hands right below the elbows, we are told that that keeps the forearms vertical, so that keeps your wrists safe. But why I want to say that this is actually a little bit less functional, less supportive of your shoulders, comes down to two reasons. The first part is that if you keep your hands in this position, your shoulders are likely to fall forward. So if we compare that to instead, again, a more classical push-up position, keeping the shoulders more in line with the hands, what you're going to end up having is now your elbow is not vertically set above the wrists. Now your elbows, so if I get into this position, I'll do it in a kneeling plank again, just so it's a little easier to talk. Now, if I do it in this position, now there's nothing below my elbows that will prevent them from collapsing to the floor. Now, this is good for us in this case, because if your elbows fall backwards, they are more likely to take your shoulder back, right? Because if I'm in this position and the ground is here and my elbow is starting to collapse towards gravity in that position, then as the elbow goes down, the shoulder goes back and up because distal parts of a bone have to move in opposite directions when they move. So when you're holding yourself in this position, you keep your hands underneath your shoulders. That means your elbows now, as I said, have nothing below them. So their tendency to collapse into the floor will help you pull your shoulder back further. And to add a little bit even more kind of a colorful description to this, you want to look at it in terms of what muscles we're using to hold low plank and what muscles oppose it. So low plank is a pushing action, right? It's a push-up. And just because we're lowering down, it doesn't mean it's not a push-up. It's just a push-up that you're lowering yourself deeper into. Now, what happens is as you lower yourself further and further into a push-up, the muscles here on the front of the shoulder and the chest, those muscles become more stretched out because it's really this section of musculature that helps you push. And so if you move too far in the opposite direction, these muscles become stretched out, and when they get stretched out, they lose strength. And this comes down to just the basic, what's called length-tension relationship in the muscle, which is just a description that at the extreme ends of any certain muscle length, you have the least amount of force, the most amount of weakness. So let's just do that by comparison to your bicep, right? Say you're doing a bicep curl. Say this is a heavier weight than it actually is. Your muscles are known, tested, scientifically proven to be weakest at the beginning. So if this was like 50 pounds, it would be impossible for me to get it to this position. But at the same time, if I go all the way in here and I bring my wrist or my forearm close to my shoulder, then again, I lose contracting power. And then to go from this position and even trying to get my hand all the way to the shoulder becomes pretty much just as hard as it was to get my elbow bent in the first couple of degrees. So where we have the most strength in any muscle is somewhere in between, right? So if I had that 50-pound weight and I had a little bit of assistance starting, right about at this point, I would be able to actually recruit most of my strength and actually lift that much weight. But I wouldn't be able to in the beginning because just the way that your muscles are laid out, your myosin, your actin fibers, they don't have too many hooks in each other when the muscle's at its fullest length. And so we want to be able to get some contraction. And so that angle, or not angle, it's more that length of a muscle where you have the most power is called just simply resting length. Now, why I'm bringing that up is because if we're ultimately doing a push-up movement through the low plank, but then we lower down and we let our arm go back too far into extension, right? Because this, as far as your upper arm bone with respect to your torso, is opposite to this, which is what we need. If we go back too far in this position, we are lengthening the muscles that we need to push to their extreme end where we just saw we have the least amount of strength. And so again, if we lower down, if we let the upper arm go too far back, then again, we start to inhibit any active protective mechanism on the front of the shoulder, and again, leave our shoulders open to danger and injury. So how does that actually come together with where you place your hands, whether in line with the shoulders or in line with the elbows? Just simply look at it this way. If I let my body lower down to where my upper arms are parallel to the torso, my elbows above the wrist, how does this angle compare as opposed to if I have my hands in line now with the shoulder? So you see, just moving my hand up, and when you're in low plank, of course, that means when you move your hand forward. When I move my hand this way, which way does the upper arm go by comparison to this classical position? Right? Doesn't it move more into flexion? And so if it moves more into flexion, that means you're not putting a stretch and you're not putting at length all these muscles that you need to push, so you're already keeping the integrity of these muscles, the engagement of these muscles, so as to better protect the front of the shoulder. And the third way that this really helps us is because of the pose that we are now going to go into from low plank to upward dog. So what we need to do, as we know, is we need to go from low plank and we slide forward to upward dog. And we slide forward because if you look at the feet, you start with your toes curled, and then you need to slide forward, and the sliding forward brings you to the top of the feet, and then you can use your arms to start accentuating the back bend. But if you begin your low plank way out here, there's nothing more that you can do to pull yourself any further forward. So what you'll oftentimes see people do when they do low plank this way is they'll come down and they'll have this momentary retraction backwards, almost like a little slide backwards before coming up. And they do that maybe even subconsciously for the exact reason of being able to slide forward, because when you're an upward dog, you need to be able to exert this kind of a pulling, extending force on the arms in order for the chest to go forward and up, right? Your arms have to go this way so that your torso and your body can go that way. So if you're already all the way out here, what you'll see people do is they go back a little bit and then they come up. And if you set yourself up with your hands underneath the shoulders, that's not actually necessary. So you can see that as you lower down here, hands are in line with the shoulders, elbows are out to the sides, and then I slide forward. My feet easily come to the mat, the top of my feet easily come to the mat, and then I got my upward dog back bend. And so to close on the technique of upward dog, we need to look at how exactly to place the elbows and what to do with the arms so that upward dog is a little bit more effective, safe, successful, right? All of these very synonymous terms. So when you get into upward dog, I'm just going to go straight into it. What you want to be able to do, as I was just showing, is you want to be able to pull your body forward and up. So when you pull your body forward and up, what do you need from your shoulder blades? And you can, again, just analyze this in terms of tendencies. So if you just let yourself stay in the posture more kind of slacked and lazy, your body and gravity will be collapsed to the ground and you'll end up in this position. So if I face the camera, right? So this is kind of like more of a lazier version of doing this back bend, doing this upward dog, than if I actually pushed into the floor and attempted to lift my ribs above the level of the shoulder. So this requires a pushing down of your arms and what's called shoulder depression, scapular depression, so that my chest can actually emerge and the back bend can actually look like a back bend. But the second part that your shoulder blades need is called retraction. So retraction as opposed to protraction. So if you simply just try to squeeze your shoulder blades together on the back, you notice again your chest expands and you have more of a back bend shape in your body. So when you go from your low plank, as you start to slide forward, this sliding forward action is this, right? So it already starts to bring your arms down, and as your arms come down, your shoulder blades come down into that depressed state that helps exalt the position of your chest a little bit better. So you come down, you slide yourself forward, your shoulder blades go back, and then at the very top here, as you pull yourself forward, that starts to organize the retracting, which is just this, the retraction action of your shoulders, that then do this to the chest. So your final posture, your upward dog, has to still maintain what we covered in the beginning, which is core. Now, I said in the beginning, when you're in high plank and you don't really activate the pose, your abdomen is likely to fall down. But the great thing about the vinyasa is you've gone from your high plank to low plank, and you've done it with this concentric firmness, this fundamental activation of your core, which is a flexion pattern in the abdomen, and then you import that right into a back bend. And what do we need in a back bend in order for the back to be safer? Is we need to switch off the dominance on the quadriceps as much. So we still keep them turned on. You don't want them to be slack, and you activate more of your glutes. And I already covered this in the previous post. But as far as the core is concerned, you still want to engage your core in the same way, even though you're not in this position anymore, right? You're in this position. But since you're in a back bend, containing your core will help you to keep a lot of pressure off your lower back. So you still have the same lift of your boot bone, and you still, maybe you don't pull your ribs down as much because you actually want to separate the distance between your pelvis and the front of your ribs a little bit. You still want to keep your core engaged just for the sole purpose of spinal safety, and like we saw in Chaturanga and high plank, for shoulder integrity, because your shoulders will be much more likely to fail you when you're here if your core is slacked. But if you still keep the engine of your core as you established it in high plank and low plank, if you keep it running in upward dog, then the action of your core will not only keep your spine safe, it'll be much more likely to keep your shoulders safe. And then we won't review the return back to downward dog, because downward dog is kind of a pose unto itself, and most of us practice it a lot more successfully, fortunately or unfortunately, than we do the vinyasas. So please take your time with this. Thank you for watching. Message me with any questions or any future video ideas. Much love. Namaste.